The moment Daniel Carter walked into the glass tower with a borrowed tie and tired eyes, he felt it in his chest, that quiet, familiar warning that today would be another reminder of how far life had pushed him down and how little room there was left to breathe. And before the story pulls you any deeper, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and quiet strength that changes lives, please take a second right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this are for people everywhere who refuse to give up. Daniel had not come to interview for a corporate position, at least not in his mind. He had come because the email said, maintenance assistant, temporary. And temporary was all he could afford to hope for as a single father balancing rent notices, school lunches, and a little girl named Lily who still believed her dad could fix anything as long as he tried hard enough. The building itself felt unreal, all steel and silence, and Daniel kept smoothing his jacket, remembering how 3 years ago he'd been an engineer with a future, before his wife's illness swallowed their savings and then her life, before his company downsized and his resume started to look like a story employers didn't want to finish reading. Somewhere on the 42nd floor, Eleanor Whitmore, the billionaire CEO known for her ruthless efficiency and legendary instincts, sat impatiently reviewing her schedule, irritated that her assistant had double-booked interviews on a day she'd sworn off hiring altogether. When Daniel stepped into the wrong room, clutching a folder with wrinkled papers and hope taped together by necessity, Eleanor barely glanced up, assuming he was the last executive candidate for a senior operations role she no longer believed anyone deserved. What happened next shocked everyone, not because of what Daniel said, but because of how he carried himself. No rehearsed confidence, no buzzwords, just a quiet honesty that spilled out when asked about leadership, responsibility, and failure, as he spoke not of profits but of promises, not of power but of people, explaining how real leadership meant showing up even when you were exhausted, because someone smaller depended on you. Eleanor felt something uncomfortable stir as Daniel described nights spent fixing broken appliances instead of sleeping, mornings packing lunches before sunrise, and the way his daughter's smile made every setback survivable, and for the first time in years, the CEO forgot to interrupt. The interview stretched far beyond its allotted time, tension building as Eleanor pressed harder, asking about strategy, ethics, sacrifice, and resilience, expecting him to crack. But Daniel didn't, because life had already tested him in ways boardrooms never could. Outside the room, assistants whispered, executives glanced at watches, and no one could understand why the most powerful woman in the company was still talking to a man whose shoes were scuffed and whose hands trembled slightly when he spoke about stability. When Eleanor finally realized the mistake, that Daniel wasn't a high-level candidate at all, but a single dad who'd wandered into the wrong interview, the room fell silent, and Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment and apology, ready to leave, ready for rejection like he'd learned to be. But Eleanor didn't dismiss him. Instead, she asked him one last question about what he'd do if given a chance he didn't expect, and Daniel answered with a truth so raw it cut through her armor. He said he'd protect it, grow into it, and never forget what it felt like to need it. That was the moment something shifted. Eleanor remembered her own father, a factory worker who'd taught her integrity before ambition, and she saw in Daniel not a mistake, but a mirror of the values her empire had quietly abandoned. What she did next sent shockwaves through the building, as she cancelled the remaining interviews, instructed HR to draft a new role tailored to Daniel's skills, and announced she'd personally mentor him, not out of charity, but because the company needed leaders who understood struggle from the inside. Daniel walked out of the tower that day stunned, unsure whether to cry or laugh, clutching a card that represented more than a job. It represented dignity restored. The weeks that followed were not easy, because opportunity doesn't erase trauma overnight, but Daniel worked harder than anyone, learning, stumbling, rising, while Lily waited each evening by the door, proud without fully understanding why. Slowly, colleagues noticed how Daniel listened before speaking, how he stayed late to help others, how he questioned decisions that ignored human cost, and Eleanor watched as the culture around him began to soften, productivity rising not through fear, but trust. Months later, at a company-wide meeting, Eleanor told the story of the mistake that saved her from making the biggest error of her career, reminding everyone that resumes rarely show the weight someone carries or the strength it builds. If this story is touching something inside you right now, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or one bad day away from giving up, please pause for a moment and like this video, share it, and let your engagement help stories like Daniel's reach someone who desperately needs it. As Daniel stood in the audience, Lily beside him in a borrowed dress, applause echoing like a promise kept, he understood that life hadn't rewarded him for suffering, but for enduring without losing kindness. And just before this story ends, we ask you one special thing. Comment the word hope if you believe that one unexpected moment, one human decision, can still change everything.